By the time I worked at Disney, my podcast was like a top 10 how-to podcast. My first year in business was like insane. 6 months into it, I was already making almost $200,000 a month. I'm 60 employees around the world, a multi-million-dollar company, and started a podcast network. I always had celebrities from the start because I just shot for the stars from the first moment I started the podcast.
This is the Content Capitalists Podcast. We talk to business owners who've used video to grow their businesses to $1 million a year or more. How they did it, what worked, what didn't. Welcome to the Content Capitalists with your host, Ken Okazaki.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Content Capitalist Podcast, where I have conversations with people doing at least $1 million in their business, many times off the back of the content they're creating. Today I have a guest with me, and the reason this person is special, there's a lot of reasons, but let me just read you a couple things that might impress you, especially if you're in the podcasting space. A lot of people call her the podcast princess, and she ranked #1 business podcast in the US and California specifically. And also, I'm going to look over here, entrepreneurship podcast, #1 ranking in the US, and #1 trending education podcast across all apps globally. That's a lot of things stacked up on top of each other, especially with a crowded space as podcasting is today. This is not the early 2000s when, only one out of, maybe there, 500, 1,000 podcasts. Nowadays, everybody's doing it. But to poke out your head that far above everybody else today is amazing. Her name is Hala Taha. Welcome to the show.
Ken, I'm so excited to be here. I love going on podcast interviews with my friends and super impressed by everything that you do and excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much. And I got to also say that there's, when it comes to the guests I have, I think that there's two main categories. And there's people who got down all the technical, methodical ways to do things. And there's people who rise to a lot of success based on personality. And I feel like you're one of the rare people who have built both those pillars up very well. And that's why I'm excited to have you on the show.
Thank you. That's so sweet of you to say.
Well, for the sake of our viewers who may have been living in a cave and have never heard of you, could you give us like a quick rundown on what you're doing today? Like how do you describe yourself?
Sure. So my name is Hala Taha. I am the host of Young and Profiting Podcast. Like you mentioned, we're a #1 business podcast on Apple, #1 entrepreneurship podcast on Apple. Back when I was in the education category, also was rocking that category. I've been doing this podcast for 5.5 years. And 3 years ago, I launched an award-winning social agency. It's called YAP Media. I'm one of the biggest influencers on LinkedIn. That's really how I grew my brand initially. And so now we're the #1 LinkedIn marketing agency. I also have a podcast production agency under the YAP Media umbrella. And now I'm running the #1 business and self-improvement podcast network, where I've got about 25 top business shows in my network, like the Investors Network, Jennifer Cohen of Habits and Hustle, Trent Shelton is in my network. And I grow and monetize those shows. And so I basically have built 2 businesses off the back of my podcast. And that's a little bit about me.
Amazing. Now, here's the thing. I'm listening to all this. And for me, quick backstory, I've only been podcasting barely a year. I think this is going to be like episode 56 or 7-ish, our talk right now. And I'm not nearly at the level you are with podcasting, but already I'm starting to see some positive results, including getting to hang out with people like you. But I think for a lot of the viewers who may not have started or who have not found that success, what you just said there might come at them like a wall that they feel they can't climb. Like if I think of that, like, how am I going to do that? I can kind of see a path there, but for some people, it might be difficult. Could you take us back to before you even conceived of yourself as a public figure? Like, what were you doing?
Yeah. So when I first started my podcast, I was actually working in corporate. So I was working at Hewlett Packard. My last year at Hewlett Packard, I was 4 years into it. I then started my podcast and then went to Disney and really built my podcast while I was working at Disney streaming services. And so this was me waking up in the morning at 6 a.m., working on my podcast, doing my social media on the train, going to work, doing my interviews at lunch, and during my break in, the corner or in any meeting room I could find. One time I did an interview in a bathroom so I could get it done. So this is me being extremely consistent and basically working 2 jobs for about 2.5 years. And so I did it as a side hustle. But I will say, before all that, when I was in college, I worked at a radio station. My junior year of college, I got an internship at Hot 97. It's the number one hip hop and R&B station in the world. And I was actually an unpaid intern for 3 years. And I was Angie Martinez's assistant, who is the voice of New York. I was basically the assistant producer of the number one radio show in the world. And so that gave me a lot of broadcasting experiences. I learned how to do research. I did all of her research and questions for her interviews. I answered the phones. I did audio editing. I was dabbling in social media. I was helping them with their blogs. And so it really just like immersed me in this whole world, right? And so I started to become pretty popular on Twitter, and I figured out that platform. This was like 2010. It was a long time ago. So this was I have nothing close to an overnight success. It was just like, grinding it out for many, many years to get to where I am today. So after I left Hot 97, I started a blog. And it was the sorority of hip hop. I basically recruited 50 girls in the entertainment industry. I taught them how to blog. I learned how to create websites. We basically hacked Twitter, went viral all the time, became a very popular blog site. So this is what I did from like 25 to 28. We almost got a show on MTV. And then MTV basically pulled the plug on me 2 weeks before they were supposed to air. And I didn't get this reality TV show. That's when I hung up my hat and I was like, forget it. I tried to be on radio. I got rejected from radio. I also got rejected from Sirius XM. I was almost going to be Sway in the Morning's co-host. Also got rejected from TV. And then I figured, all right, maybe I'm not cut out for this. And I went into corporate and I really focused on marketing. I got my MBA, got a 4.0, and I did amazing in corporate. And I had this really cushy job. I got promoted many times. And I was
What were you doing in corporate, if you don't mind me asking? Like, what was your role?
I had every role in the marketing department at HP. So I just kept getting promoted and promoted and promoted. So when I first started my corporate career, I thought that I was going to be so behind everybody else because I was basically an entrepreneur since college. Since even before I ended college, I was an entrepreneur. And then all of a sudden I was put in a corporate setting and I was like 27 or 28 years old starting my first corporate job. So I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be so behind everybody. I didn't look like everybody else. I didn't dress like everybody else. I didn't talk like everybody else because I had basically learned on the internet. But what I found is that I was actually so much more tech savvy than everybody else because I had learned on the internet. And so I was like their digital whiz kid building websites and hacking their social media. And then I like all the things that I was good at and was actually my true calling, like doing interviews and stuff. I started interviewing the CEO at the town halls and the CMO at the town halls. And they would fly me to Spain and London and host all their conferences. And I'd be on the mic, talking about Hewlett Packard. And so I was doing the same stuff, but just as an entrepreneur within a corporate setting. And so I did really well at HP. But 4 years into it, I had the itch and I was thinking, I want to get back to broadcasting. I saw podcasting. People were like Jenna Kutcher was like out there being like a top female podcaster. Amy Porterfield was already starting to podcast at this point. And I was like, there's this thing that's really accessible that I know how to do everything for. I can audio edit. I can video edit. I can do scripting. I know I can get guests. And then I just basically started this podcast and I was consistent from day one. I never gave up, even when I had no listeners. And really, it was LinkedIn that opened the door for me. I decided that I was going to build my personal brand on LinkedIn. I felt like Instagram had known me for like the sorority of hip hop. Twitter had known me for something else. And I was like, let me just start over on LinkedIn. And I became a LinkedIn influencer first, became the number one podcaster on LinkedIn because I was really just breaking the noise, talking about something new. And Lewis Howes and Ed Milet and all those podcasters, they were sleeping on LinkedIn. So I just sort of, stepped in and made noise and grew my podcast from there.
Amazing. And you said that this was, I think you said 5-6 years ago that you started the podcasting?
2018, yeah.
Wow. Okay. And okay, so what's impressive to me is that you're able to go through probably 10 years of a lot of tons of consistent work, but you made it sound easy and fun. I would like to just take a moment here and ask you, like, what were some of the mistakes you made in that process? Because like the Rocky cutscene, the struggles, because everybody's going to face these. But when they hear, somebody who just never stops and always wins, it's like Michael fucking Phelps here, right? But like, what's something that that tripped you up early on, if you don't mind?
Well, one thing that I'll say is that, like, Young and Profiting, it's my first podcast, but it's like my fifth or sixth show. All the while I was working at Hot 97 and when I had my blog, I was doing online radio shows.
Yeah.
And none of those shows went anywhere, right? Like I had like a YouTube show, I had a Facebook show, I had a music show. Sometimes I would interview cool people like Soulja Boy or Chris Brown or something like this, and that was fun. But really, the shows never went anywhere. I never really monetized anything. So by the time I started Young and Profiting, I had so many reps under my belt. So I was definitely way ahead of everybody who just started a podcast because I literally had all this experience as a foundation. So I think that's number one. It was like all these failures actually taught me a lot to become a better producer, better podcaster, better marketer overall. But in terms of like mistakes that I made when I first started Young and Profiting, one of the mistakes that I made in the beginning was I was so focused on Apple downloads. And everybody on Apple was somebody who had been doing podcasting for like 5, 6, 10 years already. And they were the ones dominating the top of the platform. So Jordan Harbinger, Lewis Howes, all these really old school podcasters, Tim Ferriss, for example, right? And I kept comparing myself to them and thinking like, I've got all these fans on LinkedIn, but like, I'm not even ranking on the charts. I'm not even ranking on the charts. And I felt like my growth in general was stagnant because it was really hard to get discovered on Apple. And it wasn't until I stepped back and I had something to leverage. I basically had, now I have 230,000 followers on LinkedIn. At this point, I had 60,000 followers. And for me, I felt like I'm officially an influencer. Like I have a platform that I can leverage. And I remember thinking about the fact that there's so many other apps other than just Apple, right, that make up the market. I learned that Apple and Spotify at the time, they had like 20 to 30% market share each. And then like 30% of the market share was just like 70 other apps out there. And I thought, well, maybe I can reach out to those apps and see if they would be interested in me promoting them on LinkedIn in exchange for them promoting me. And at the time, I had no idea about media buying. I had no idea that you could advertise on the podcast players. I didn't know anything about it. All I had was like my team of interns and me with like my crazy big ideas. And so I was like, okay, let's put together a list of every single podcast player out there. Let's find all the partnership contacts. Not only the podcast players, let's find every single podcast blog. Let's find every single podcast hardware company, software company, anything to do with podcasting, and let's reach out to them and see if they want to collab. And the first way I grew my podcast was actually by trading my audience. I would trade my LinkedIn audience in exchange for getting featured on an app, in exchange for getting featured in an email or on a website. And then all of a sudden, all these apps started to sponsor me. This was about 2 years into it. Before that, I had very stagnant growth. I was just growing on LinkedIn and getting subscribers one by one. It wasn't word of mouth. It wasn't in mass. Like it was a very slow growth thing. Then Castbox really gave me my first big break. So Castbox really liked the social media that I was doing. They weren't working with any LinkedIn podcasters, and they basically sponsored me every month. And then suddenly I had like 500,000 subscribers on Castbox, and my downloads, my chart was like this, like, you know what I mean? So I blew up. I became like the #1 podcaster on Castbox. Now I have over 3 million or something downloads from that platform alone. Then I just started doing that on other apps, Player FM, Podcast Addict, Overcast, Podcast Republic. So I'm very different from other podcasters who really only have their audience on Apple. I really have my audience spread out across all these different apps. And I really only figured out Apple like a year or two ago, right? And I was just this podcaster I used to always say I'm #1 in education across all apps, because in Apple, I still wasn't shit. But across all the apps, I had a lot of subscribers, right? So I just took a different approach. So it's always thinking about, I think really the lesson in this is that there's more than one way to the top of the hill, right? And I just figured out a new path. I was really one of the first podcasters to do that. And then I realized that you could actually do advertising for podcasts. And then I started growing shows by doing the same tactics that I used to get for free, like trading my audience. And then I started selling those ad spaces to podcasters that I produced in my network. And then I became an expert on growing shows too. So it's like all these things that you learn for yourself, you can then kind of deliver for other people.
I should hire you to help me with my podcast, because I'm just up and coming for sure in this space. A question came up as you were as you're describing a bit of your history, and you said you had shows on Facebook, YouTube, various platforms before you found what's working right now. How did you decide when to cut your losses in these various places that you invested so much time and effort into?
It's a good question. I think things just like naturally fell apart. A lot of these shows that I did would be with like co-hosts. So like, for example, once I shut down my website, my blog, that show ended, right? Other shows would be just like with my, like one of my best friends, we did like a Facebook show. It's like, we would just move on to the next thing. So they all ended pretty naturally. I wouldn't say there wasn't like, oh, we failed. And also at the time, I don't even know if I had any strong goals. Like I was just messing around trying to have fun. This was my passion and I was young, you know? So I know that's probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but it just
No,
like
it's good.
naturally just like ended and we moved on to the next thing.
Okay, that makes so much sense because I hear these stories sometimes of people who are slugging it out for forever before they got any kind of uptick in their progress. But then there's also the people who sometimes, like from an outside perspective, you just want to say, look, you got to shoot that dog because it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And what do you advise for people around that? Like, because you mentor a lot of people either through your podcast or through your agency, right?
Yeah. I mean, I have a really good story about that. When I had the sorority of hip hop, I did it for 3 years. And basically this was basically a company where I had a blog site. The blog was very popular. I used to host events and parties. All the DJs that I knew from Hot 97 would actually hire me. And I basically had 150 girls in and out of this organization. And after we didn't get the MTV show, I decided to shut it down. And I had 50 angry girls that were my best friends that then hated me because I decided to shut this down. And my logic was that we're not making, like, we weren't making, it was 3 years of effort, all of us pouring in. We were barely making any money. And I realized that if I wanted to be successful, I needed to do it on my own, and that I needed to work on myself. I needed to get more skills. I needed to just take a step back. And I realized that this was like a sinking ship. And looking back, I bet you we would have blown up if I had just stuck it out one more year. So I always think back, like if I had just stuck it out, because we were doing so good. We were famous in the tri-state area, but we just weren't making any money. But I knew that I needed to step back and grow and get the skills that I needed. And I don't regret it because I feel like now I'm really in the right place. I'm in the right niche. It's not a music show. It's a business show. It's something I feel proud of. It aligns with my values. And so it's like, I think that there's a certain point where you need to decide whether or not, you know, spending the time that you need to get something off the ground is going to be actually worth it in the end, because it might not even align with your values anymore. Like you've grown out of it. And if you've been doing something for 2 or 3 years and you still haven't really made a profit or turned a profit, for me, that was enough time to know this is probably not the right idea for me. I could keep pushing at it, but why should I keep pushing at something that is just like not a downstream thing, that is just always feeling like an uphill battle? With Young and Profiting Podcast, there's been periods of stagnation, but for the most part, it's been, you know, fast growth.
Amazing. I got a couple questions here. Okay.
Yeah.
Biggest influences when you were starting out with podcasting?
So I was really into Freakonomics with Steve.
Oh, I love
Covey.
that.
Yeah, he's so great. That was one of my favorite shows. Jordan Harbinger has always been a mentor for me. I actually willed him to be my personal podcast mentor. So he's an amazing interviewer and also really great at growing and monetizing shows. So learned a lot from him. Tim Ferriss, I always say I want to be the female Tim Ferriss. So those were some of the guys that I really looked up to.
Please don't shave your head.
No, I won't.
Tim Ferriss is absolutely, like, he was early on in this game of thought leadership. Like he practically invented that category, or at least made it aware for everybody, right? And really early on.
He really did. And it's like, it almost seems like impossible to catch up with him, because if you got started that early in the game, it's like really impossible to catch up.
As long as he keeps going, you know, like some people just retire, really, you know?
Yeah.
Okay. Second question. Books you recommend for people up and coming?
So I love this book called The Like Switch by Dr. Jack Schaefer. I've probably listened to it on Audible 50 times. And basically, it just tells you how to be a more likable person and how to have really great first impressions. I'm really obsessed with human behavior in general. So anything by Robert Greene, The Laws of Human Behavior, really, really great. Love Robert Cialdini, The Law of Influence. And then Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference, is really great as well.
I love that one. My kids listen to that book. I've got kids and they flip out over that book. And what they tell me is like, Dad, this is like a cheat sheet. Like, is it actually okay? And these are children and they get it. And that book was brilliantly put out with so many great stories and examples.
Yeah, this is great.
Right now, what I'd like to know, and as much as you are allowed to share, because my audience is here because we're business owners and trying to figure out how to get the content to convert into something that makes sense. First question is, how long did it take since you launched a podcast to when you started seeing a return on your investment? Like clients coming in, people paying you money. Like, what was that gap?
It was about 2 years. So I first made money on my podcast from the guests that would come on my show.
So they'd pay you cash to be your guest?
No.
Oh, okay.
So I started a social media agency. And at the end of my show, so I basically had a volunteer group since I started Young and Profiting. By episode 2, I had my first volunteer, who's now my business partner. By episode 8, I had 10 volunteers in a Slack channel. And
I'm going to pause there. How do you get volunteers to work for you at that early age, at that early stage in the business?
This is like a hidden talent that I had, because with the blog, I had at any given time 50 bloggers that worked for free for me and would go to events with me and stuff like this. I've had like alumni associations.
This is what you need to write a book about.
Yeah.
How to get world-class, talent to work for you for free.
Yeah. I mean, it's how I start now. I pay everyone, I feel like all I do is just pay people. But when I first started, everybody worked for free because I wasn't making any money. And essentially what happened is I became really popular on LinkedIn, and fans would reach out on LinkedIn and they were obsessed with the show. And they would tell me, Hala, this changed my life. I just want to help.
Wow.
Can I get involved? And so it would just be fans.
So this is the law of reciprocity going on here. Like, you've given so much value to them in mass, and then individually they can actually help you back.
Exactly. And I was like, I think it was just so obvious how hard I was working, because I would be staying up till 1 a.m., waking up. I got no sleep for like 4 years. All I was doing is just like working on this podcast and just trying to make it the best it could be, and was super focused on quality. Like, I would study like 30 hours for all my interviews. And so I think the effort really showed from my side, and also the creativity in the marketing, because I was really good at video editing and did like, comic book audiograms, and nobody was doing that. And like just little things that at the time was like really innovative. So these fans would reach out to me, and like one guy was from Estonia, and he was like, I want to help. You don't have a website. I'm going to help you build a website. And I was like, okay, cool. I'll teach you how to do whatever I need. One guy from Atlanta was like, I want to learn how to do videos. I'll do all your videos. So I taught him how to do videos, and like somebody would take over my social. And then all of a sudden I had 20 people in a Slack channel for 2 years, and everybody had their job. Some people would do research, some people would do social, some people do videos. And I would just train people. They worked one-on-one with me, and we were just like a big happy family that was obsessed with YAP, right? My podcast. Now, when I had guests on the show, I had this big LinkedIn presence. I was already, by the time I worked at Disney, my podcast was like a top 10 how-to podcast. I always had celebrities from the start, because I just shot for the stars from the first moment I started the podcast. So I always had big people on the show, even before we had the downloads. Now, these guests would end the show, and half the time they would say, Hala, how did you grow on LinkedIn? How did you do this podcast? Can you do this for me? And I would always just be like, no, I'm sorry. Like, I've got a career at Disney, because I was so scared of being an entrepreneur again, because I had failed so miserably when I was younger. And now I was making like well over 6 figures and had this cushy job. And I was just like, nope, I have this career at Disney. This is just my hobby. I have a volunteer team. I'm so sorry. I must have said that 20 times. I'm so sorry. I can't help you. I'm so sorry. I can't help you. Until one day, Heather Monahan, who's still my client in my podcast network, basically didn't leave me alone. And she would be stalking me on my LinkedIn, like, Hala, you got to do my social. Hala, like, let's have a call. Teach me how to do these videos. So I basically was like, Heather, I can't help you again. Like, I have a career. It was COVID now. The world had shut down. I was at my parents' house. My dad had actually gotten COVID. He ended up passing away. I was at my house for 3 months, stuck there because I couldn't see my friends, couldn't see my boyfriend. It was right when COVID happened. I got COVID, so I was like, had the cooties, so nobody could talk to me, didn't have a commute, had more free time. I still was telling Heather I don't have time to do her social. And I was like, I'll teach you on the weekends. And so I would get on a call. I showed her our Drive, our Slack, our templates, our process. And I was trying to teach her how to make videos. And she was like, Hala, I just had a call with VaynerMedia, and your stuff is 10 times better than theirs. I want to be your first client. I'm not going to take no for an answer. You're crazy. You already have an agency. You have a team. Like, let me be your first client. I was like, okay. So we did her social. She must have only paid us like $700 a month, like nothing. We took over her podcast for LinkedIn. We did a great job. I started getting all the processes in place. Then my next client, it was a billionaire who invited me on his podcast, Jason Waller. He was the CEO of the fastest growing private company in the world. He basically, at the end of my interview with him, he was like, do you do social and podcast services? I need somebody to take over my stuff. And this time I was like, yes, I do. I had no website. I had no logo. I had no company name. I just said yes. I put together a proposal. It was $30K months retainer, and he said yes. And that was my second client. And then everything
That's a big jump, isn't it?
From there. Yeah. So everything just skyrocketed from there. I got the CEO of Hintwater, Kara Golden. I got the CEO of 1-800-GOT-JUNK. And then I started just creating this LinkedIn and podcast production agency and Instagram and YouTube, and figured out all the stuff.
Yeah.
And then now I'm 60 employees around the world and multi-million-dollar company, and started a podcast network. So the first way I monetized is through the guests on my show. Once I figured that out, I was then able, because of that experience of me getting featured on all the apps, I knew there were advertising opportunities, and I could maximize doing those kinds of things. And I knew which players worked the best because I gotten sponsored by all of them.
Yeah.
So I'd reach back out to those people, and I started buying ad space. Then my podcast blew up, and I started getting sponsorships and making money that way as well.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you for sharing that, because
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, they're not aware of all the different ways that podcasts make business sense. I think most people are like, they hear podcasts like Joe Rogan, and all they hear is him going on for 3 minutes about all the sponsors, and they think, oh, that's how you make money, right? There are so many other ways to do it. And I think there are, as I say this so many times, there are as many ways as there are people who are doing it right. And that's something I did not know. Let me ask you a question real quick, and let me just check my notes here. Biggest inflection point. Now you've already gotten a few clients in your podcast. I mean, sorry, from your podcast for your agency. Did you see things just keep going up like a ramp, or did it kind of go up, then peter off, and then go up again? Like, do you see inflection points where things slow down or sped up in your business?
My first year in business was like insane. It was like, just, we were making money out of our ass. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it was just because I basically had 2 years of all I did was just build the brand, build the brand, build the brand, build the community, build the trust. Then I started selling. And even with my audience, I didn't start selling till a year later. I was only selling to my guests, basically. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time I had something to sell, there were so many people who wanted my services. I had like a wait list of people wanting my services. So within the first 6 months, I was still at Disney. I built this as a side hustle. 6 months into it, I was already making almost $200,000 a month. And I had 30 people around the world. I have 60 now. I had 30 people around the world who were getting paid to work at my company. And I was still doing it as a side hustle, because I was just so used to doing it as a side hustle, because for many years I had it with just volunteers.
A $200,000 a month side hustle is not a bad gig.
I don't know what was wrong with me. I had a partner who didn't want me to quit my job.
That's going to have already eclipsed your salary by now, for sure, right?
Way eclipsed my salary. But I had a boyfriend at the time who didn't want me to quit my job. My family didn't want me to quit. Everybody was scared that I was making the biggest mistake of my life, because I had this great job at Disney, and I was so failed as a young, like, everybody thought I was a failure when I was working at Hot 97 and stuff. So everybody was like, you finally made it, and now you're going to ruin your life, when it was like the exact opposite. I was taking my life to the 10th level,
Yeah.
But I didn't listen to anyone, thank God. And really the inflection point was Matthew McConaughey came on my show. Matthew McConaughey came on my show, and all of a sudden everybody was like, oh my God, you made it. Like, I had already thought like things were good, but to the outside world, I had made it because Matthew McConaughey came on my show. Then I got on the cover of Podcast Magazine. This was January 2021. And once I got on the cover of Podcast Magazine, I knew that this Matthew McConaughey thing was airing. That's when I quit my job. So that was one of the biggest inflection points. It took all of that for me to decide to quit my job, that I got on the cover of Podcast Magazine, got Matthew McConaughey. And I was like, okay, this is obviously not a fluke. I've been getting consistent clients for 6 months. Nobody's leaving. Everyone's happy. Let me just take this full time. So I took that leap. I think another inflection point was my dad dying. That's when I started my company. When he had COVID and was in the hospital was when I was taking those calls with Heather Monahan. And, I really felt like at that point that life was, finite, and I needed to just sort of take it to the next level. I really felt when I was younger, I really believed in the law of attraction. I really believed that I could do anything. And then as I got older and had all these failures, I stopped believing in myself as much. Even when I was started Young and Profiting podcast at first, I feel like I would have maybe grown faster had I had the same mindset. But I just treated it as like, it's never going to go anywhere. This is just a hobby. I'm just trying to help people. That's just how I felt for 2 years. I literally didn't even think it was possible to make money on a podcast. And I didn't ever think that I was going to have a really huge podcast. I always thought it was going to be a hobby as a side hustle.
Mm-hmm.
And when my dad died, I flipped a switch and I was like, no, like I'm meant to do this. I've been doing this my whole life. It's actually working. I have all these opportunities. Let me just dive in and really give it a shot. And when my dad died, it's crazy. Like my dad died and everything changed. My podcast blew up. I started a company. And everything just really went way bigger after that. And I think it was a mindset switch because I realized that life is, finite, and I've got to, live my life and go after my dreams.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And I have not experienced close relative dying like that, but I'd imagine that completely changes the paradigm. All the references and everything that up until that point, what it meant to you, can shift very quickly. I want to ask a question, which I think a lot of the listeners are right now going to be in their minds. And I know you said that you've always scored the A-listers on your podcast, and you have some history with the different artists you work with and stuff. But if that didn't happen, how would you recommend, maybe not you, but somebody else, actually being able to build connections to the point where you get those A-listers on your show?
Well, I think to get A-listers on your show, you need to really have social proof, or you have to have really good marketing where people can see the potential in what you're doing, or at least want the marketing assets for themselves, right? So I don't think it's possible to get A-listers if you don't have the social proof, if you don't do something that's going to be of benefit for them, because they don't have a lot of time. Now, there are A-listers that go on every show if you know who they are. So like, for example, like John Lee Dumas will dedicate time every single month to go on any show. David Meltzer will dedicate time to go on any single show. So some people have that in their strategy, and you can sort of figure that out if you listen to enough podcasts. The other thing that I'll say is that know your story, know what your potential is. When I first started my podcast, I had 0 downloads. I knew, first of all, this was a volume game. I knew that I wanted to have certain people at a certain level. I didn't want to just like have Joe Schmo on the podcast. I wanted my favorite authors. And I remember when my first episode came out, it was about first impressions. So I looked up every single business book about human behavior, about first impressions, anything that could sort of be aligned to that. And I made a list of like 50 people, and I reached out to all 50 people, and 2 people said yes. My favorite author, Dr. Jack Schaefer, and Dory Clark. 2 pretty big guests for a brand new podcast, right? 2 out of 50 said yes, and that was good, because then that gave me leverage to get the next yes and the next yes and the next yes. So it's a volume game.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I did, even though it wasn't even a launched podcast, so that's the hardest thing to get guests for. Hey, this doesn't even exist yet. Take a chance on me. But I gave them my backstory. Hey, I used to have a blog. I used to work at Hot 97. This is my first podcast, but it's not my first rodeo. Here's the ways that I'm going to promote it. Take a chance on me. And then a lot of these people that took a chance on me in the beginning, I've now invited back on after I have like, lots of subscribers. And now they're like thanking me, like, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come on. And it's just like everything's full circle.
It absolutely is. Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. I think what you've done is you've demystified the glamour into actually it's a numbers game. Email this many people and then you'll get a certain amount and then build on that. I think people glorify or they put on a pedestal the success stories and they tell themselves, I can't do that because I don't have 1 million followers. Thank you for that story. It completely obliterates all those objections. I want to know right now, could you give us kind of a lay of the land on how much time you're spending in research, planning, actually producing content, and how that fits into like a weekly or monthly schedule for you?
Well, now I'm such like a bad example of this because I literally have a production and social agency, right? So like everything is delegated. So, but you were gonna ask me now?
We could all have hashtag goals, okay? This could be a hashtag goals section.
Sure. So, okay. So how do I manage my content, plan my content? So first of all, my job is to show up and be prepared and record my podcast. So we batch my podcast days 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. I used to study 20 to 30 hours per interview.
Wow.
Now I have a researcher. My researcher studies about 8 hours for the interview. So he reads the book, he writes questions, he writes notes to the questions, and then we have a framework that basically says like, what are their latest books? What are their links? What is their career journey? What are their key challenges? And it's like all this stuff that I basically read and study instead of me having to figure that out. Somebody else does that for me and saves me like 8 hours of time. I study 4 hours now before my interviews. 2 of those hours, I'm getting hair and makeup done. And so I'm on my computer studying when somebody's doing my hair and my makeup. Then I hop on, do the interview, do the intro. Okay. I do my outro afterwards, and all my ads is what I do not live. I do I have lots of ads. So I have to record 5 or 6 ads a week, video as well for YouTube. And then I record my outros separately to save time, and my intros a lot of the time I record separately. In terms of the production, I have a production team that creates videos. I'm about to work with Ken to help us with our videos because we want to outsource that. And so we chop up about 8 different clips from the podcast episode. We also edit the full podcast version. We edit reels and shorts, which are basically the same thing, to put those up. We edit the full video, which we use on YouTube, and we replay on live stream on LinkedIn and YouTube. And then as well, we create an Instagram version of the live that we play on Instagram Live. So that takes up a lot of hours and is a lot of people. I can't tell you how many people. The YouTube, we need to put the titles, the show notes, the keywords. We have to create the show notes for the podcast. And then flighting all the ads is a whole other thing too for
Amazing.
the sponsorships. So that's pretty much the flow of what
I will tell you firsthand that research section that you did when I was on your show, you started asking me questions that were deep in my book or some posts I made a long time ago. And I was like, holy crap, she really does do her research. I've been on a lot of shows. I'm not as many as you, but nobody has asked me the kind of questions that caught me off guard to the point where it's like, how would she know that? And I was genuinely impressed. So I think that every single guest that comes on your show, if they had the same experience I had, we're like, wow, if there's somebody who is going to do the work and get it done right, is going to be her. And that's why I believe people would reach out to you afterwards. Is like, if I could have the privilege of working with you, would you please accept my money? That's the attitude I think that people will come to you with because of the dedication you put into it. I've never seen anybody else do the same at the same level as you have, honestly.
Well, thank you so much. I think it's because I was the underdog, so I needed a way to differentiate myself before I had any money. Because when you have money, you can just buy your way to the top, right? I needed something else, and that was studying, because I wasn't an expert on anything either. I mean, I'm a marketing expert, but my show's an entrepreneurship show. So I knew that if I wanted to have that meaningful conversation with the AI expert or the brain expert, I really needed to understand my stuff to get that content out of them.
Amazing. I got a couple questions. Okay. Somebody just getting started today. Let's say they don't have a podcast. But they've got a legitimate business. Let's say it's in services. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they have a lawyer firm. they're not on social media. What do you say to someone like that? It's just like, I need to get in the game, but I don't know where to start.
That's a really good one. If you're trying to get in the game and you have no social or digital
But
presence,
you do have
I
money,
would
like you have a real business, just don't
you
have
have
a
money.
presence.
Got
Yeah.
it. So what I would do is I would find an agency like mine or Ken's to help you build a brand. If you're doing well and you have no marketing, that is the best business to invest in digitally because you know that you can already sell and convert people. The other stuff works like clockwork in terms of creating a magnetic brand, creating content, understanding algorithms, all that stuff you can just learn and figure out and do well. If you have an offer that converts already, that's like 50% of the battle, or I would even say 70% of the battle, because that's the thing that's really individualized that you need to figure out on your own. Everything else, if you work with experts, they'll know how to grow your YouTube or your podcast or your personal brand on LinkedIn and Instagram. You just have to vet the right people that have proof that they've done it before, right? I would say the platform to focus on as an entrepreneur in many cases, especially like a service-based business, would be LinkedIn. LinkedIn has a lot of opportunity. It has 135 million daily users, and only 6% of people on LinkedIn are content creators. So there's lots of people on LinkedIn all the time. These people are generally, professionals. They're college educated. Most people make over $75,000 a year. They're primed for sales conversations. They're using LinkedIn in their buying journey to do research and things like that. And so I would say the first place to start and mine and get ROI right away would be LinkedIn. Because there's opportunity. You can crack the algorithm. There's organic reach there still. So there's just so many different reasons why it's like very inexpensive to actually grow your brand and make money on LinkedIn. So for me, that's like, and I have a LinkedIn masterclass where I teach people how to do this. And I would say for me, that's the number one place where I would tell people to start. Podcasting, 2 years into it, you're going to make money, right? Instagram, really hard to get organic reach. YouTube, really hard to get organic reach. YouTube also is something that can be really lucrative if you know what you're doing and you're working with the right team, but it's a lot harder. LinkedIn is something that with a small team and a small budget, you could get a lot out of.
Thank you for that. Amazing. I also find that on LinkedIn, people are thinking more business. YouTube, they're thinking entertainment, right? And when you're thinking business, you're more likely to invest in your business. So that's like, if you're looking for clients, I'm hearing the same thing a lot from other people too.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say, if I can just,
Go ahead.
For a small business owner, an entrepreneur, the other angle would be to have a podcast where you interview your target clients. This is really a great idea, can be lucrative right away. And that means that your goal as a podcaster isn't to have a huge audience. You do want to have an interesting podcast to have a decent audience. You do want to have great marketing so that you can attract the guests. But if your goal is just to convert your guests and use it as a networking tool, podcasting from the beginning can be really lucrative. So I have a lot of clients who do that and who are really happy with a small show because they make so much money off their guests.
Amazing. Now, for somebody who's a little bit further along, that they've got that legitimate business, they've got things going on, but they're doing everything themselves. How do you recommend people make the decision around hiring and building your own staff and team, or working with an outside agency, for example, like yours or mine?
This is such a great question. I almost never see anyone really successfully internally handling their marketing. I always get people who will come to me for social services and they're like, we have our own marketing team. Like, we're trying our best. We're not getting anywhere. And then I'll be like, okay, I can help you. And then let's say they don't work with me. They'll come back to me 2 years later, like in the same place. And I'm like, okay, do you want to take it to the next level now? Because what happens is that these internal marketing teams tend to have so much going on. They're working on events. They're working on a newsletter. They're working on mailers. They're working on this. There's no way they're going to understand the actual algorithm or how to, like, what features are working, how to make the videos work, how to do every single little thing. Even me, I have my own social agency. I'm about to outsource my video marketing to Ken because he's literally the best in the business, right? I know I can't do it better than him. I can do a lot of things probably better than Ken, but not videos, right? I know he's going to do it better than I will. So it's like you've got to trust yourself with people who are real experts if you want really explosive growth. Internal marketing teams, in my opinion, are really tough unless you guys are really strict about leaning into one or two things and really learning and getting training. Like, for example, I have a LinkedIn masterclass. The same training I give to my team, I give in my masterclass. So if a CEO sent in 2 team members to take my masterclass, then you're on a really good foot because you've got the training, you've got the methodology, your team has a strategy that actually is proven and works, right? So if you invest in your team and you have focus, I think it can work internally. Otherwise, I really think you need to outsource it to experts. And I think that you'll save a lot of money in the long run doing that. And you can work with an agency to make sure that you have the right voice and everything like this. Like usually there's a liaison and you still need one marketing person to sort of liaison with the different agencies. But I think that's the best model. One marketing person that liaisons with all the vendors who are experts in their individual fields.
Thank you so much for that. We've got to wrap this up in just a couple minutes.
Sure.
But a couple last questions. If somebody were to become interested in either just learning from you for free, finding out if you have courses, or hiring you as an expert to help them, like, could you give us kind of the lay of the land on what's out there?
Sure. So if you want to learn from me for free, I would say the best thing to do would be to subscribe to Young and Profiting Podcast. I interview the brightest minds in the world, like Alex Hormozi, Seth Godin, Robert Cialdini, Chris Voss, you name it. They've been on the show. So I always have amazing guests. And I love to unpack their wisdom. And like we talked about, I do my research and it's a great show. So if you want to learn from me, Young and Profiting Podcast. In terms of my paid courses, I have a LinkedIn masterclass and I do it about every other month. The next class is September 6th and 7th. I also have a class coming up in December. And if you guys want a code, I'm actually going to create a special code for Ken. You can go to yapmedia.io/course and you can use code Ken for 30% off. So that's KEN. yapmedia.io/course, and you can get 30% off our upcoming masterclasses. And I hope you guys join me. We go over everything from how to create a personal brand. I do exercises to help you guys create a personal brand, copywriting. We go over the psychology of design, the LinkedIn algorithm, engagement and publishing hacks, and then sales and DM strategy. So it's really all inclusive. If you want to learn how to crush it on LinkedIn, I'd love to see you guys in class.
Perfect. And guys, if you're listening to the podcast, go to the show notes. We're going to have all the links down there and the details, including the code. If you're watching on YouTube, then I encourage you to go check out the description. We're going to put the links there as well. And also, if you listen to this far on the podcast, I really encourage you to go check out the YouTube channel. We're going to have a link there because she's got an amazing voice, but also she's the full package. When I say full package, she's got the studio set, she's got amazing lighting. Aside from being extremely attractive, she has the facial. I think that you should watch this just for a lesson on how to perform well visually and with content on a podcast with video. I think that I don't think I could find very many people who I could recommend as highly as you, Hala. So
thank you.
Get over to YouTube, have a look visually, because it's also a visual experience. So I highly encourage that. Before we wrap this up, is there any last words of wisdom that you could impart to my audience about anything?
Well, I know that this is all about content creation and the importance of entrepreneurs creating content. What I'd say is that the best thing that you could have as an entrepreneur is not having to proactively constantly go after your leads and do cold outreach and cold messages. And content is what enables you to actually close that loop and get people who find you, who think of you as a go-to person, where people will be reaching out to you and then you can convert them. And so to me, as an entrepreneur, that's always my goal. How can I have a magnetic brand that is pulling people in where I'm not having to do all the work constantly trying to get my leads? And so for that reason, I would encourage everyone to focus on one platform and start creating content so that their leads can be coming to them and people can discover and find what you're good at and what you sell. Otherwise, you're always going to have to be scrounging around for your next lead, and that's not fun. So I would just leave you guys with that.
Thank you so much. That's a value bomb right there, guys. Go do exactly that. And make sure you follow Hala on all her major channels. Thank you so much. I'm going to wrap this up and I'll see you guys next week.